Listen, my children, and you shall hear of a butchery, both far and near. It's the justice or lack thereof in the courts of which we call our own. And what they did to Canadian Native Americans, Canadian Indigenous people, raped in their schools, murdered, given blankets with smallpox. You're watching On Second Thought. I'm William Wagner, and we're going to go right to the heart of it with a DVD blessed to us by Reverend Kevin Annett, who's about to be part of the Second International Tribunal in March of 2020. Here we go.
Spread in our community.
Smallpox was one of the most communicable diseases in human history and was responsible for the deaths of untold millions of Indigenous people around the world, even after a vaccine for this disease was discovered in England in the 18th century. In reality, smallpox was a chief weapon in the deliberate germ warfare waged by European powers against native peoples because of its brutal efficiency. Within 10 days of contracting the disease, the victim was dead.
I'm a descendant of Samson Piel. Samson Piel was the original family that were here. And Samson and his brothers and his sisters were the last ones left when they came back after fishing and working wherever. They got back, all the family were dead from the smallpox epidemic. And they were floating all around the beach here and somewhere up by the creek over there. And they had to bury them all.
There's been a study of a general called Jeffrey Amherst, and Amherst, Nova Scotia is named after him. He was a British general who conducted germ warfare against the Mi'kmaq Indians in Nova Scotia. And in the 1740s, he kept a journal of this. And he was so brazen, he didn't hesitate to record what he was doing in the journal. Again, because they didn't figure they'd ever have to answer to anybody since they were the law. And in it, he describes how they would go into hospitals where their own people had been dying of smallpox. And they took the blankets and he gave it to one of his subordinates, a major, who then took it out among the Mi'kmaq and the other Indians who were allied with the French, like the Huron and the Algonquin-speaking Indians in the eastern part of Canada. They were targeted. In fact, most of the Huron were exterminated by smallpox. So they were openly admitting that they were doing this. And all up and down Vancouver Island, you have stories of the same thing happening, although happening through the missionaries primarily, because they were the first ones into the area. Harriet describes in her village a little place called Claouse near Port Renfrew on the west side of Vancouver Island. She says in the 1860s there was 3,400 people there. By the 1890s there were 44. So it had gone from over 3,000 people down to 40 some odd people. 98.5% of the population gone. And that was mostly from smallpox. And their people say that missionaries and British sailors had been dropping off these blankets to them that were laced with smallpox, and that's how so many people died. You don't get that many people dying, kind of accidentally. Somebody caught a cold one day. I mean, that isn't the way those things happen. It was germ warfare.
Tuberculosis was another weapon in the arsenal of germ warfare used against native people in Canada. A fiercely communicable disease, spread quickly by air and contaminated food, tuberculosis was responsible for many of the deaths of children in Indian residential schools across Canada. According to government officials like Dr. Peter Bryce, residential school staff deliberately and regularly exposed healthy Indian children to tuberculosis by forcing them to sleep and play alongside children dying of the disease, and then denying them aid or treatment. It was this murderous practice that was responsible for an annual death rate in the residential schools of nearly 50%.
We're in the same room with people who had TB. They didn't separate us.
Then we were forced to play with them. The nuns made us play with those kids. We didn't want to get sick either, but they were forcing us to play with those kids. And also, they made some of them sleep with the other kids too.
The interesting thing was at the University of British Columbia, where I began to study for a doctoral degree, I began to find these records from a report by a guy called Dr. Peter Bryce, he was head medical officer for Indian Affairs. And in 1907, he went on a tour of all the schools out here, like on the coast and in the prairies. And he found that he claims that over half the children were dying every year from tuberculosis. And specifically from a practice whereby healthy children were brought in and housed alongside children dying of tuberculosis. And then none of them were treated or helped in any way. They were left to die of this communicable disease.
Why?
Because they wanted to kill off at least half the children and wanted to cull the numbers down. And Dr. Bryce, this is not some flaming radical, he's an establishment doctor who's reporting back to his boss, the Duncan Campbell Scott, who was head of Indian Affairs. And he said in his report, the quote is, "I believe that conditions are being deliberately created to spread infectious diseases." So he was clear, children were being deliberately murdered by a practice of contaminating them with TB. That practice was referred to consistently. It's now even talked about in some of the mainstream academic books about the residential schools. So it's gradually been accepted, although it was reported on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen as far back as 1907. This is from Schools Aid White Plague. This is a discussion of Dr. Bryce's report. It's from November 15th, 1907. About 100 years ago, they said the average death in the residential schools in the West was 69%. So over 2/3 of the kids die after 1 year in these schools. That's talked about in the mainstream press, and yet today so many people are acting like, oh, we didn't know this. Well, it's been public knowledge for a century in Canada.
There's about 50% of the kids that died of TB. And one thing I can tell too is that the chief over there now, her mother had 12 siblings. She was the last one that lived out of that school. She's seen 12 of her brothers and sisters go in there, plus herself, but she came out. She said then the other ones never made it home.
The Indian residential school system in Canada was an extension and evolution of an older system of genocide that began as early as 1540 in eastern Canada and during the 1840s on the Pacific coast. Its foundational purpose was the deliberate and systematic eradication of all indigenous populations that would not leave their lands and resources, abolish their own cultures and languages, and become Christians. That purpose has never wavered, but has assumed different forms and strategies over the centuries, adapted to the times and regions in which it played out as European conquest moved westward across the continent. European Christianity and its colonial empires were the plague. Residential schools were a refinement of that contagion. By the time that residential schools were firmly established across Canada, around 1900, the plague itself had exterminated most Aboriginal people in a genocide whose details are still largely unrecorded and perhaps forgotten.
Well, we can look at the evidence of genocide we can look at it and yet our mind not register the fact that it's proof of what we're talking about. This book is used in the university curriculum about residential schools. It has been for almost 10 years. And here's a picture of children with active tuberculosis sores. You see the bandages around their head. And the inscription says they have active, like open tubercular sores, and they're sitting here alongside healthy children. That was the practice described by Dr. Peter Bryce when he said they were being deliberately exposed to diseases. They weren't being quarantined. When you have tuberculosis, you're quarantined. You don't sit with healthy children. This is proof. This is proof of intent to commit genocide, this picture right here. Yet it's in a mainstream text. People look at it, and still to this day they say, there's no proof that we're trying to kill Native people. Well, the proof is right there in that picture. In that practice, which was happening in every residential school across Canada, and it was documented by their own people.
How did the parents and the relatives allow this to happen? The natives?
Well,
Did they do anything?
They weren't allowed to. One of the documents I found is a thing called the Application for Admission Form. And it's a document that every Native parent had to sign or they'd go to jail. And what it did was it actually surrendered guardianship rights to the principal of the residential school. So what this did is you had to sign away the guardianship power of your own child to the clergyman who ran the residential school. And at that point, the principal of that school then became the legal guardian of the kids. So that explains why these things could happen, how it could happen. because they were the legal guardian. They could do whatever they wanted to these kids. I remember when I released this to the press in 1997, we were holding a press conference and two officials of the United Church snuck into my briefcase and stole these documents. We got that on film, actually. But they were very worried that this stuff was coming out, and because it proved, that they were culpable and liable. And as a result, in 1998, the Supreme Court Justice Hogarth here in BC ruled that the United Church and the government were equally liable 50-50 for what happened in the residential schools.
I was angry at my mother for years till I met her. And then she told me she was forced to. It was in the Indian Act. The cops came there and they were going to take us, or she'd go to jail, be fined, or all three. And that's in the Indian Act too, it is. It's in the Indian Act.
The Indian Act of Canada is race-based legislation that legally separates Indigenous people into a separate and inferior class of citizenship under the control of one man, the Federal Minister of Indian Affairs. The Indian Act allows Aboriginal people to be expelled from their homes on reserve lands, arbitrarily jailed, subjected to involuntary medical treatment, and denied the right to elect their own leaders. Under the Indian Act, Native people are legal wards of the Canadian state in perpetuity, having the same status as children or the mentally incompetent. This racist legislation has remained essentially unchanged since it was first enacted in 1876. Its philosophy and regulations were drafted under the guidance of the Roman Catholic and Anglican churches through the Bagot Commission created by the Vatican in 1845. The Government of Canada enacted the recommendations of this commission in 1857 when it passed the Gradual Civilization Act. This legislation forced Indigenous people to surrender their land and identity and denied them any future title to their land, which was now owned entirely by the Crown.
That's what genocide is when you look at its definition. It's two steps. The fellow who coined the term, Raphael Lemkin, who helped draft the UN Convention on Genocide, he had a simple definition of genocide. Phase one is you eliminate the original pattern of a particular targeted group. You wipe out their language, their culture, you take them off their land. And the second phase is imposing the pattern of the domineering group on them. And that's exactly what happened in Canada, like in any colonized area, but it happened primarily through the churches here.
This is the grave of Harry Gallad, and for me, he's the epitome of the problem. You notice his grave has been desecrated. He was an Anglican missionary. He worked for the government as well as the Indian agent, and he also worked for the local timber company. He was like church, state, and company all rolled into one, and he was the man who brought in the local residential schools, who made sure that the children were all imprisoned in the school. He is single-handedly responsible for a lot of the misery around here in the native world. So I'm not surprised that somebody desecrated the grave. This cross is a symbol of all the suffering these people have gone through.
Before you entered the ministry, you did not buy in what the church was doing. What did you think the church was doing?
Back then?
Yes, before you entered the ministry.
Well, I knew that it was mostly talk. I mean, even as a kid sitting there in the United Church, I knew that you could just tell things. As kids are very intuitive, right? And they knew that these people aren't living what they're claiming. I mean, they're not loving one another. Is anyone coming over to our house when we're struggling? My dad doesn't have his job anymore. We had to move down to a hotel in the downtown part of Vancouver. Were any of the church people coming over and helping us? No, not even the minister. You know, we were the pariah family all of a sudden. So I knew it was bullshit. But that didn't take away from what I felt in here was the message of Jesus, which to me was revolutionary. It wasn't
So
just,
where did it go wrong, Kevin?
well, you cut me off there. Wait.
Sorry.
It wasn't just that Jesus was a nice guy, right? You're the benign, kind of loving man. It was like the hippie, right? That's never how I saw him. I saw him as a revolutionary. He got murdered because he was challenging the powers on behalf of the people who didn't have any voice, on behalf of, the outcasts. I mean, the woman who was going to get stoned to death, or the people who are on the outside all the time, the guys who get shit on all the time. They finally had a champion. And he said, not only am I your champion, but God is too. God loves you more than the asshole is doing that to you. And that's a revolutionary thing to do. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was like to me a new world. And I saw the church perverting that message. I saw them taking the side of the wealthy and the powerful, and they do this all over the world. They crucify Christ again and again, just like they're crucifying the poor. And I said, that's got to stop. I mean, that lie has got to stop. Well, it's like the early Roman Empire. They realized, look, we're not defeating these people. The more people we burn in the Colosseum and throw into the lions, the more people are being converted. They have a moral power here that's growing in the world. Our soldiers are becoming Christians and are saying we don't want to fight anymore. You know, the whole empire was unraveling. So they were smart. They said, you can't destroy a movement like this. You can co-opt and pervert it. And that's exactly what they did. They opened the door. They said, come on in and sit down, guys. Take a seat in the empire. We'll turn you into something successful. You know, we'll give you power so you can convert people. We will give you the means to conquer in this world. You don't have to be persecuted anymore. And they accepted it. They turned their back on Christ. They shut the door on him. And they became the church. They became Christendom, and they got blood all over their hands as a result. But he's still outside the door there. And I was trying to open the door.
When a lot of the stories began to hit the press about, when the lawsuits began against the churches and the government of being brought by residential school survivors, at that point the church decided to, quote, delist me, which was to actually throw me right out altogether.
The person who had arranged the hearing, he was the executive secretary of the church out here, Brian Thorpe. And he had arranged the hearing, chosen the panel members. The hearing was in the room of the church of a friend of his. And in addition to that, he was one of the four testifying against Kevin. I mean, here the judge and jury and the whole thing gets blurred. I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here?
This is natural justice, isn't it?
And this was natural justice. But this whole business of them, they knew I was taking notes on all the things that proved there was nothing going on according to natural justice. They saw me writing it down each time.
Did they know who you were at the time?
No,
Did they know your background, or did they just think you were some busybody?
Oh, they just thought I was a little old lady with very little to do. But after the first week there, I realized this was Canadian history, United Church history, and Native history.
And deserves to be told.
And I made a point of trying to be there all, 36 days of the hearing that went over 6 months.
It was the first public and only public delisting of a minister in United Church history. It was really like a show trial to make an example of me. But at that trial, the lawyer for the United Church, a fellow called Ian Benson, he said the reason these Reverend Annett is being recommended for delisting is not because of anything he did while in the ministry, but because of comments he's recently made to the press about the deaths of children in Indian residential schools. So they were very clear. They wanted to get rid of me because I was continuing to talk about these deaths and murders. So in the period after I was fired from my job in Port Alberni, my wife and family and I had to move back to Vancouver where I could seek out retraining of some kind. I enrolled at the University of British Columbia. And basically at that point the attitude of the church was to put me on ice and try to ignore me. And it wasn't until February 1996 that they suddenly revived their demand that I be expelled from the church altogether. And interestingly enough, they did that 2 days after it was publicly announced that the first lawsuits would begin against the United Church and the federal government brought by survivors of the Alberni residential school. A lot of these plaintiffs that were suing the United Church had been in my congregation. I had been working with them, providing them information. Obviously the church wanted at that point to just expel me from the church altogether.
The purpose of the hearing was a total railroading and a processing to get somebody who had far too much information for his own good out of there. He'd stepped on big toes. He'd stepped on moneyed toes. And the whole thing was to get Kevin Annett out of there.
So sure enough, that same year in 1996, the United Church decides to go ahead and defrock me as a minister. I think the antiseptic term they used was delist. And in so doing, they spent over $250,000 tossing me out of the church. Something I found pretty repugnant because that previous year, the church had told me that they couldn't come up with about $1,000 a month to feed the over 300 hungry families that we're providing food for through our Loaves and Fishes food bank in Port Alberni. And yet here's suddenly $250,000 to get rid of one whistleblower. Also, the two men who had originally arranged my firing from Port Alberni, John Jessamine, the lawyer for the United Church, and Brian Thorpe, the chief executive officer in BC for the church, these are the two guys who are not only responsible for my appeal, but for setting up the panel
that's going to decide whether I'm going to remain a minister or not. So the whole thing from start to finish was a complete travesty of justice.
It was terrible. At moments, I really wondered if I were in Guatemala or Mexico rather than this quiet, late summer afternoon in this church in downtown Vancouver. I couldn't believe the things I was hearing. The whole thing, I mean, I just remember, for example, that Kevin Annett had a great number of unsolicited letters of commendation for his work and his ministry. And he had always made his ministry a tough ministry, a challenging ministry. And I think that all these letters had come in, and not one of them was allowed to be read. I believe Mr. Jessamine said, people here can read for themselves, these letters don't need to be read. But isn't it interesting that at the end of that hearing, Mr. Jessamine didn't have the same philosophy at all? Because when they solicited letters against Kevin Annett, and we know this from a person who phoned in from Manitoba, when they solicited these letters, all of those were read and put on the record.
You know, for centuries, people have had three basic rights under common law. Those are, the first is the right to no charges being brought against you. The second, the right to face your accusers. And the third, the right to a trial before your own peers. Now, all three of those rights, called natural law, were totally denied me by that proceeding that threw me out of the United Church altogether as a minister. To give you an example of that, I was never told what the charges were against me. They repeatedly said, there are no charges against you. I asked to face my accusers. I said, who are the people who brought these concerns to you about my ministry? They refused to tell me who they were. And finally, when I'm appearing before that delisting panel, they weren't in any way my peers. They weren't people who I knew. They were three hand-picked individuals who were actually friends and associates of one of the men who had me fired, Brian Thorpe.
I feel it will remain a very black mark against the United Church of Canada. It was a very disgusting type of procedure. I would call it a witch hunt. It was a question in my mind as to why a church would be carrying out such an activity, why they would be spending the money. I mean, there are many aspects to this. I think probably the important one is an attempt to simply break down a personality, and why they should be wanting to do this. Reverend Annett was someone who had the trust of the natives, of those underprivileged. And it seemed to me that the church should have been making use of him.
Finally, one of the most absurd things is, right at the very beginning of the proceedings, we asked the panel, what are the grounds for defrocking a minister in the United Church? We have to know that in order to mount some kind of defense, to show that, in fact, I am a credible minister. Molly Williams, who was head of the panel, said, in front of all of us, she said, there are no grounds for delisting a minister. We will decide what those grounds are at the end of the hearing. So by doing that, there was no way I could mount a defense, because I didn't even know what the terms of the whole hearing were.
I mainly took down notes of things where events in that hearing did not conform to the laws of natural justice. In the first place, there was no charge. There never was a charge through the whole hearing. Now, the church people have lied about it since and said there was a charge. There absolutely wasn't. If they want to look at the church records, there was no charge. They kept saying there is no charge. We only want to see if Reverend Annett is suitable for ministry or not. The charges never even got made up. The first I saw of them was late March with a letter that came out in the Courier where suddenly I saw charges listed against Kevin Annett. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that went on, but very dangerous and very hurtful nonsense.
The people who I counted on as who would stand by me, they all ran for the hills. I mean, people in the churches, it was kind of like, I call it the leper complex. They know to give you a wide berth, because if they get close to you, it might happen to them too. So I was pretty much ostracized. And speaking of South African apartheid, it's like being a banned person. You know, in South Africa, when you were banned, you couldn't meet with more than two people. Your name couldn't be mentioned in the press, etc. That's basically the situation I'm in. The media won't cover my stuff. There's all this story out there about how Kevin Annett is crazy and trying to bring down the church and blah, blah, blah. And that's so that the people in the wider society never have to look at what I'm talking about, look at the evidence, because it's a way of keeping that evidence delegitimated. and it works.
I can't believe what went on there. And, I think that Jack Bell said it all. He just couldn't stand to watch it. It was obvious that you had stepped on some pretty big toes and that you were going to be slaughtered for it.
On March 7th, 1997, Kevin Annett was permanently expelled from United Church Ministry, despite the failure of church officials to offer any evidence that he was unsuitable for that calling. His expulsion was final and could not be appealed. The same day, Kevin was issued a legal writ by church lawyers that tried to prevent him from speaking about his delisting trial or any issue involving Native people and stolen Indigenous land. Kevin ignored this gag order and continued to speak out publicly about his firing without cause and expulsion without due process from the church responsible for the deaths of so many innocent children.
Historically, it was interesting how everything was coinciding, because as I got thrown out of the church, the first lawsuits were being brought against the church and the government by the survivors of residential schools. This would have been in early 1996. And right at the same time, kind of like the attitude was, well, you got tossed out of the church, you must have done something right, kind of from the point of view of Native people. And they began to, the trust level went way up because I wasn't part of that institution anymore. And I was being invited down to these healing circles in the downtown east side of Vancouver to listen to people's stories. And then eventually they began to ask me to record them for them. And that's when I began to seriously document a lot of these stories that went...
Up until that point, you had not documented anything that was said at the
Well,
church?
I hadn't systematically gone about it. I had, written down notes and that people had shared with me, but it was clear from the things they were sharing that this went far beyond the physical and sexual abuses that are talked about in the press. Well, they're not talked much anymore about, but for a while they were. People were describing children being sterilized, being murdered, being used in medical experiments, being deliberately exposed to tuberculosis and then left to die.
They realized, and I realized with them, that all we were doing is sitting around hearing everybody's sad stories, and it wasn't going anywhere. The people were not recovering from this. There were a lot of lawyers and Native politicians making money off their pain, but they weren't changing anything in their life. I'd know people who'd tell their story and then go kill themselves.
Well, was there a design to heal people, or was there just a design to have people talk?
Healing is a word from the dominant society. It's a way for people to make money off other people. People don't heal from this. That's the reality. The first thing to realize is that I'm never going to get over this, because it's not only so traumatic, but it's so systematic in the culture. You can't heal as a Native person. The whole society is arranged against you. What you can do is to tell the truth. And I realized that about myself. I was never going to recover from this. I'm never going to be allowed into the academic world. I'm not going to be allowed to have a job anywhere in Canada. And they actually threatened me with that. There was a guy called Art Anderson who was personnel officer for the United Church who had removed me. He had come in the day and handed me the letter that fired me. And he told Bruce Gunn, my friend, United Church clergyman up in a house, he said, 6 months after I was fired, he met him at a conference and he said, Bruce, if you have any pull with Kevin, you better tell him that he'll never work in this province again unless he plays ball. And sure enough, that was an idle threat. They blocked my PhD at UBC. Every time I went to apply for work, they had been spoken to, the prospective employer. That happened a few times. There was a systematic campaign. So I knew that, like with the Native people, I was never going to get over this. But what I could do, just like them, I could tell the truth. And that was our power, just telling the truth. And that's what we began to do. Okay, we got to do more than just talk about our pain. We got to ask the bigger question, why did it happen and who did it? And why did they do it, right? So we said the way to do this is to hold a big inquiry. And we started inviting Aboriginal groups from around the world and this United Nations group, IRAM, to come in. And that's what happened in the summer of 1998 in Vancouver.
I organized a lot of the survivors to come and give testimony at this. And at that tribunal, anything you could ever imagine that went on in a Nazi death camp was described. There was a group of people from the Cooper Island Catholic school who described being part of a medical experiment in 1939 when German-speaking doctors were injecting them in their chests with these chemicals that was killing them.
I'm 100% sure that we're used as guinea pigs in these local hospitals for some unknown reason. We're lugged off the hospital, I can remember that. And I know it wasn't for dentistry, I know I wasn't sick.
I read Kevin Annett's document starting about 6 months ago, and it helped me understand how come my memory was so vague. In reading parts of it, they talked about shock treatment. In my last year there, the spring of 1961, I was taken from the school to Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, and from Charles Camsell Indian Hospital to Ponoka Mental Institute. I don't know if I was there a week or 2 weeks, but I have vague memories of it, but the memory that flashed back for me is laying on this table and stuff in my head, and then these flashing lights just continually.
They had put needles in my head and had hooked them up electrically and would zap me. At that time, my arms were put in a chair and locked in so I couldn't move. And my head was put on a brace in the back so I was like this, I couldn't move. And I can't tell you how long they had done it. All I remember is that I still, to this day, I still get a, like my brain will still have that kind of a kick from it, right?
Right.
And they had done a lot of bad things by putting medications in the food while I was in the dark room, bringing the food in, and you had to eat it, and if you didn't eat it, then if you threw it up into a bag, they put it on a plate again and make you eat it.
I also went to the tribunal that was held, and although I've been with Amnesty since 1961, I had to walk out of that tribunal as the sobbing went on around me, and the gulping for air, and the crying of the natives as they told their stories. And I couldn't imagine, Canadian men, policemen, fathers and grandfathers going in and taking children out of the arms of native parents and putting them on a gunboat and taking them to these schools like Port Alberni. That all came out at that tribunal. I thought, my goodness, how could they take little 5- and 6-year-olds? And as a grandparent myself with a little 5-year-old, how dependent he is on family. How could they take those children to these schools where at best they were treated with indifference, but as we know, so much worse went on there.
We've had Chief Harry Nice, we've had Chief Joe Gosnell, we've had Chief Ernie Cray sitting in this room with tears in their eyes describing it to me themselves on television. I mean, it happened. We know it happened, and it happened in our lifetime, right? It's not 150 years ago.
Was there proof, though? Like Nazis...
Scars. They showed me the scars, and they also...
Anything written down? Any doctors write down that they went to it?
I did find documents in the Indian Affairs Archives describing these doctors, and how what was interesting was the order that was running the school, a Catholic order called the Montforts. As soon as some children escaped from these experiments, they went to the local, their families. The local police refused to return the children to the school because of these horror stories they were hearing. The next day, all the Montfort brothers resigned. They were just taken right out of there. And the Oblates come in to replace them. So there was something very odd going on, and a number of the children died, and I found the death records and everything. So there was that kind of stuff going on.
Well, did the tribunal ask for proof, written proof? Or did they accept the oral proof?
Well, they had both. They had the oral proof, and they also had some corroborating proof that this stuff was going on. They also subpoenaed the government and the churches and the RCMP to come and answer questions, because ultimately they're the ones with the evidence, the documentation of this. And every single one of them, from Jean Chrétien right on down, they just refused to come. They never answered or anything. But other things were described, the sterilization hospitals. Women showed up who described being sterilized simply because they were Indians and wouldn't go to church.
I couldn't have any more children after Dr. Darby got to me. He made an announcement in our village that anyone who wasn't in church on Sunday had to report to him for a special procedure. I never went to his United Church since they did so much harm. But Darby was missionary, so his word was law. So the Mounties came and got me and brought me to Darby. He gave me a shot. Next thing I knew, I was in bed, all bruised and hurting. I was missing all my gold teeth. Something didn't feel right inside me. I never could conceive after that. Later, another doctor told me I'd been sterilized. George Darby, he did that to hundreds of our women.
As part of the eugenics movement that swept the world after the 1920s, laws to allow the sterilization of Aboriginal men, women, and children were passed across Canada under pressure from both Catholic and Protestant churches, in Alberta in 1928 and in British Columbia in 1933. Missionary doctors of the Anglican, Catholic, and United Church of Canada sterilized thousands of Native people in hospitals all over Canada as part of the campaign to depopulate Aboriginal land to allow its occupation by European settlers and corporations. The main targets of the sterilization program were the traditional leaders of the Aboriginal nations, the tribal chieftains and their families, who were slated for extermination. Accordingly, the sterilization campaign against traditional families has continued to the present day. Dr. James Goodbrand sterilized many of our women. In 1952, when he heard I was going to marry a traditional chief, Goodbrand kept saying to me, "If you marry Freddie, I'll have to do an operation on you." That scared me, and I tried to see another doctor, but the Indian agent wouldn't let me. So when I gave birth to my daughter, it was Goodbrand who delivered her. After the birth, I hurt really bad and I kept bleeding. Then I learned that my tubes had been tied. He must have done it to me after the delivery when I was still unconscious. I heard Goodbrand say he was getting paid $300 by the government for every Indian woman he sterilized.
Are there any white people that gave testimony as to this happening?
There was a couple of staff members from the Alberta School who gave testimony, Caucasian staff members, and they confirmed everything and more than what the people were saying.
So what was the results? What did the tribunal do?
Well, the result of the tribunal was they sent a report to the United Nations to Mary Robinson, was High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva at the UN office there. And they sent a report to her. I sent 14 hours of videotape plus all of the documentation and affidavits and everything to her office. We never heard a thing. Never got back to us. And a couple of years later, I learned that it was because of pressure that Canada brought to bear at the UN to keep this issue under the wraps, basically.
How could Canada do that? You mean Canada can influence the United Nations?
Well, it has a lot of pull. For example, at the time, the General Secretary's assistant was a woman, Denise Frechette, who was a career civil servant from the Department of National Defense in Ottawa, and she was the one at the UN setting the agenda of all these different divisions and committees at the UN. So it would have been easy for her and others to keep this off the agenda.
As an arm of the Canadian government, the United Church of Canada has led this attack against Kevin Annett and his work, with the active support of covert operatives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Cooperation between the RCMP and United Church in this silencing campaign against Kevin Annett began as early as June 4, 1996, when church official John Siebert wrote to Sergeant Paul Wilms of the RCMP's E Division in Vancouver to share confidential information about Kevin, after he had spoken out in the media about the deaths of children in United Church Indian residential schools. That same month, Sergeant Wilms used this information to confront and threaten Kevin if he did not stop making public allegations of murders in residential schools. When Kevin refused to stop investigating residential school crimes, this joint harassment campaign against him by the United Church and the RCMP intensified. Between 1997 and 1998, church officials sabotaged Kevin's doctoral program of studies at the University of British Columbia by blocking funding for him, which forced Kevin to withdraw from the program. One of Kevin's professors admits having been spoken to by RCMP officers about what they called the dangerous nature of Kevin's research into United Church residential schools. Yet by far the most serious attacks on Kevin Annett and his supporters came in the wake of the historic tribunal into residential schools that Kevin organized in June of 1998 in Vancouver. His success in bringing United Nations observers to this event to hear residential school survivors' testimonies caused the government to directly subvert and destroy Kevin's work.
Naturally, it was sabotaged. And when you get big enough, it's kind of like being a germ in a system. You get big enough and the antibodies attack you, and that's what happened. It was clear from the tribunal that a lot of crimes that had never been heard about were finally out there publicly. People talked about sterilizations for the first time, the medical experiments that they were doing on kids at the Catholic and United Church hospitals, and the residential schools on the West Coast. That was all talked about. We sent it off to the United Nations, and in retaliation, a lot of shit came down on the people who did it. I mean, Harriet Nahanni, who was the person who identified, that the little girl had been killed, murdered at the residential school, United Church, when she was a witness to it. The RCMP broke into her house without a warrant 2 weeks after the tribunal. The RCMP tactical squad ransacked the house at gunpoint, held everybody at gunpoint, and just ransacked the house. People were threatened. They were thrown out of their jobs on the reserve after they'd given testimonies. I started getting followed around by these two guys who physically attacked me on 2 occasions. This was all within a month or two of the tribunal, so the heat began to come down. And I knew it is because things that were shared at the tribunal weren't just about the past. They were about pedophile rings that were being operated today with the help of Native politicians and church lawyers. It was about crimes of the present that were begun in the past but carried on today in the Aboriginal world. It all began to, the veil began to lift for me. I realized we've got a real tiger by the tail here. It isn't just about, something that happened years ago, because if it was, why would the harassment continue? I mean, the stuff in the past has been resolved. They've bought off the witnesses. They've paid off people with court settlements.
So why did they continue then?
They continued the harassment because this is about stuff today. This is about how Native people are still being exploited, how Native children are still being used, how land is still being stolen by multinational corporations, and how the Native politicians are important to this whole thing. And so they don't want the truth of the residential schools brought up because they themselves are implicated in these crimes. When they were kids, they were the enforcers. They were the ones who helped abuse and control their fellow students. So they don't want that coming out, and I began to learn that after the tribunal. And like I say, the proof was in the pudding. We were shut down. The results of the tribunal were never acted on by the UN. The media imposed a blackout on the whole issue. I was completely isolated. In the year after the tribunal, it felt like a wall was falling down around me.
Was it?
Yes, these cage doors were just closing on me, bang, bang, bang. The media wouldn't talk to me anymore. My letters weren't printed. People stopped talking to me. The Native chiefs wouldn't have anything to do with me. It was just absolute shutdown on every front.
So, why did you continue?
Well, I didn't really want to at first. It felt like this is pointless. I'm up against the state. I'm up against, the church, multinationals, their Native accomplices. I mean, who the hell is going to support me? The Natives don't want to because they're too scared for their life. The whites don't want to because they see me as a traitor. So I didn't feel I could proceed, but there was something, my mind was telling me that, but there was something inside me that was very stubborn and said, you have to keep going.
In the years following the Residential Schools Tribunal, Kevin Annett persisted in his efforts to document and make public the evidence of mass murder and ethnic cleansing in Canada. Abandoned, penniless, and attacked from all sides, Kevin nevertheless continued to speak out publicly on the hidden history of mass murder in Canada, and kept on documenting all that he had been told and had discovered about crimes against Native people. But Kevin's crowning achievement came in early 2001, when he finally published the accumulated testimonies and documents about atrocities in Canadian Indian residential schools in a book entitled Hidden from History, The Canadian Holocaust. A dozen separate publishers refused to produce the book, so Kevin printed it himself and circulated more than 1,000 copies to libraries, governments, human rights groups, and Aboriginal people around the world. But most of the books ended up in the hands of the people for whom Kevin had labored so long, the residential school survivors themselves. In the fall of 2005, Kevin completed the much expanded second edition of Hidden from History, and for the first time asked the deeper question of why legal genocide had happened in his country, what had given rise to this plague in the first place, and why is it continuing?
Kevin, you've remarked to me that the tides are changing, that things slowly are becoming made known. Yes, they are. It is very slow. Remember, it was 10 years ago that hearing took place. But I do believe that the changes that have come about are because of the price you have paid. A terrible price of what you have paid.
I think his work has been serving a really valuable purpose by bringing, first and foremostly, these issues to light. And I know Kevin's had to endure a lot of suffering and a lot of loss, particularly in his work, his livelihood, his being defrocked and losing his congregation and subsequent attacks by the church, police positions and powers of authority, and a lot of the native people that Kevin has worked with in the past as well have suffered attacks, people having their automobiles tampered with, putting their lives in jeopardy, being attacked and under constant surveillance by hostile occupational forces such as the RCMP.
Let's fire Kevin Annett. If he doesn't have a job, he doesn't do the work he does in the community, and that's exactly what happened. And as anyone knows who was involved at that time, we tried desperately to convince the United Church not to fire Kevin Annett because he was doing a lot of good work. But of course, our pleas fell on deaf ears because those people didn't live in the community, they didn't witness the good work Kevin did, and the end result is their legacy of corruption continues.
Church officials have repeatedly silenced journalists and prevented publications from reporting the facts of both crimes in Indian residential schools and Kevin Annett's expulsion from the church. In January of 1999, the globally acclaimed magazine The New Internationalist ran a brief article on Kevin Annett and genocide in Canada. In response, National United Church official David Iverson circulated a 14-page character assassination of Kevin Annett to the world media and threatened the New Internationalist with a boycott of their magazine unless it stopped all reporting of residential school crimes and Kevin Annett. New Internationalist editors buckled to this pressure and never again reported Kevin Annett's work. In March of 1999, the national magazine Canadian Dimension was similarly silenced after it ran an article by Kevin Annett on the Ahousaht land deal between the United Church and Macmillan Bloedel. United Church lawyers threatened Canadian Dimension with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit unless it publicly retracted the article, which it did. In September of 1997, the Vancouver Courier newspaper ran a front-page article on Kevin Annett that went into detail about Kevin's uncovering of land theft and other crimes by the church on Vancouver Island. United Church official Phil Spencer, who had helped arrange Kevin's dismissal from the church, tried to force a retraction by the newspaper and have the article's author, Clodagh O'Connell, fired. When this failed, Spencer went so far as to verbally harass Ms. O'Connell at her home.
I felt I had to call what I thought was the church back to its real soul, which had been lost.
And you felt you could?
Not by myself, but I felt I had to do that. I had to try.
Did it work?
Sure, it worked. Why do you think all the shit has happened? It's because it worked. After, losing my wife and kids, and trying to re-educate, trying to get a PhD, and then having that blocked, being unable to support myself, having to save my dimes and nickels every week to have enough money to go on the bus to see my kids for 2 hours, having to eat off plates in the university, other people's food, so I wouldn't have to buy dinner, so I'd have enough bus fare to see my kids. That made me feel like I was on the bottom, and that there was no one around to help me. Not even family. They just stood right back and said, well, this man should pull himself up by his own bootstraps. They didn't realize that there are all these forces in the world that were trying to keep me down that way, that the United Church did not want that PhD produced, that the RCMP did not want that tribunal done, and they tried to stop it.
But the more they tried, what did that do to you, the more they tried?
I got angry at them. I said, why? What the hell right do they have to do that to me? What the hell have I done wrong? Nothing. I said...
Did you lose your faith in the
here's the wrong I did. The wrong I did was I expected the church to live by its principles. That was my wrong.
What were its principles?
It claimed to be following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. To seek truth. They have this great statement in the United Church to walk humbly and seek justice, in the world. Well, I just expected them to do that. That's what it said on paper. I just asked them to live by their principles when it had to do with land they had stolen from the native people and children that they had hurt and murdered in the residential school. I simply said, do what's right. And I was told time and again that it was wrong for me to have done that.
You knew that it happened before. You were well read.
Yeah.
You realized that the last 2,000 years that happened.
Yeah, but I was complicit in it. I was part of the culture that did it, and I was blind to it. Raised in that condition of affluence,
I had an idea. I remember thinking when I was in my 20s, oh yeah, Native people, yeah, they've been put down. I had kind of a vague idea that they were on the outs and they had been attacked and murdered en masse and all that, but it didn't enter my life at all. I mean, it didn't really, the only contact I'd ever had with Native people was when I was 15. We went up to a village in northern BC on an exchange, and we lived for 10 days among Aboriginal kids up there, and then they came down into our community and hung out with us. But what I saw just blew my mind in that little community of Hazelton in northern BC. Just unbelievable. I didn't think people lived like that in Canada. You know?
Lived worse than you did.
Well, I mean, yeah, even the poorest white person, they didn't come anywhere near the experience of what was going on in that village. Kids running around, I mean, not just literally without clothes and dying from malnutrition, but I mean, you know, there'd be like, there was a little 6-year-old girl whose dad had gone after with an axe. You know, she was carrying a mark around on her head because her dad had whacked at her while she was drunk. And that was just accepted. Like, I mean, oh yeah, well, it wasn't considered there was anything wrong with that. And I thought, well, these people, I think I was scared by that. You know, and so when I got older, I thought, well, Native people are kind of an oddity. I don't really want to understand them too much. I mean, that was all going on in me. But then I realized I had to. The more I began to work with them, I had to understand.
And what did you come to understand?
Well, it didn't come right away. It came over time.
What came?
What genocide really looks like, up close. What it means to be at the receiving end of a campaign to exterminate you. What it means to be the survivors of mass murder. You go around with, you feel like you're going to die at any moment. You're going to be tortured at any moment again. So all you have to do is hide. You got to hide.
You could identify with that?
Oh yeah.
I still have nightmares about snakes and all the kind of things that happened to me in school, and very difficult, you know. Sometimes I tried ending my life many times because I just couldn't stand the pain that I was going through.
He took each of us in there one by one, and he had us bend over and had Vaseline with him. He did that to each of us 3 times, I remember that. To satisfy himself, to enjoy himself on little kids. I forgot how old I was, either 6, 7, or 8, maybe 9, I forget. But I remember, I'll never forget Mr. Moore.
He said, you know what, sis? He says, I can't wait to get out of this hellhole. I'm going to tell everything. And then the phone went dead. People at Cooper Island always listened to our phone calls and censored our letters back, you know, coming in and going out. So I was afraid for him, but I didn't think it was going to be as bad as it was. It turned out as bad as it was. 2 days later, we got a phone call saying that he hung himself. He committed suicide. But I'd never, ever believed in my heart that he'd ever do that. They had them walk through the gym while Richard was still hanging and told them that it could happen to them.
My brother died because of a cattle prod, of a shock of the cattle prod. When he was 4 years old, they dragged him by the hair and they cut his skin right off his head. The pastors did that with a whip, like a horse whip. It was sharp, with these little blades on it. And when I was in there, I heard him scream for help. and right away there was a lot of blood on the floor, and they wouldn't take him to a hospital or the nurse or nothing. What happened then? What happened when I was in there? I heard him still scream for help. Rick, help! They're torturing me. I'm gonna die. So he died right away, like that. He was my only best friend and my only brother that I always loved.
What would be the final solution for you? What would relieve your mind or give you comfort?
Well, you know, when you're dealing with a crime this huge, there isn't any solution ultimately, because it's not as if something like this can be healed. It's like when you look at genocide being perpetrated on one group of people, it never stays confined to that one group. It always blows back on the people perpetrating it. And I often think about that when I look at, you know, what we're doing to the land and the environment. I mean, we destroyed people who had been living in harmony with the land for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And that can't help but affect us and the way that we live. But I think that something this huge, you can't just give an apology and a bit of money. It's an insult to people who have been sterilized and seen their friends murdered to think that that's going to solve anything. But what will begin to turn the tables on this is if the perpetrators are brought to justice and are able to say, yes, we did these crimes, yes, we did try to wipe you out. I often know, working with Native people who've been through these death camps called residential schools, for them, they never talk about money, they never talk about compensation. You know, a lot of the Native politicians will talk about that. But the people on the ground, they keep saying over and over, I just want to face the people who did this to me. I want to tell them what I think about them, and I want them to admit what they did to me in front of the world.
I think if they did that, I would forgive them if they would just admit what they did to us is genocide.
And the government has never ever came up and acknowledged their mistake of a residential school. And to me, that's totally wrong. And the churches are hiding behind the laws of man-made laws and not admitting their wrongs regarding residential school. And I feel that's cowardly.
They're thinking they figured they could get away with it?
Oh yeah, of course
Why
they
did
could
they
get
figure
away
they
with
could
it.
get away with
Because they were the law. The church and the government were and still are the law. Churches are exempt from prosecution for these things, clearly. For almost 10 years, the knowledge of these things have been out in the press. The courts have refused to prosecute the churches over these crimes. Time and again, judges have said this issue of genocide is not going to be addressed in this court. They restricted at issues like, well, the children suffered a loss in education, or you know, they were hit sometimes, but they've refused systematically to address the issue of murder and genocide. We know that in just the residential schools, the official death rate given by the government themselves was 50%. And if they took they claim 100,000 children went through the schools, but that's conservative because they would often grab children in whole areas, not just the 7-year-olds and up, which they had to do under the law, but 3, 4, 5-year-old kids were common in the residential schools. So if you double their number, you're probably talking 250,000 children went through the residential schools. Half of them who died, 100,000 children alone just in the residential schools. When you look at the whole history of the Indian reserves, and it's got to be in the millions.
If they want evidence, as a 7-year-old child, I witnessed myself the burial of a child, and I didn't know what was happening at that time. I was with another student, and I asked him, I said, what's happening here? I see them digging a hole in the orchard, and they said they're burying another one.
In '65, there's a bunch of us kids playing soccer in the backfield. There was a brush of leaves and grass piled up, and there was a body underneath it. One of the kids kicked the ball, and he went to
Well, I'm William Wagner, your host. You haven't even seen me on this episode. I thought you needed to hear this. This is about how the 3 main churches up in Canada for a century, people, were eradicating the native Aborigine Indians of Canada. Both the Roman Catholic Church, who Pope Benedict was indicted for this, should have been indicted for something else, but we'll get to that later. I think we have good video now. The Queen of England was indicted. 3 of Pope Benedict's top cardinals were indicted. Benedict resigned, his 3 cardinals resigned, because they, in effect, were responsible. They were the top of the churches. Also, the Anglican Church, the United Church of Canada, were giving children and Native Canadian Aborigines, they were giving them smallpox-infested blankets and then mixing the healthy children with those that had smallpox. And we showed you those pictures in the beginning. If that isn't a crime, I don't know how you can define crime when they're genociding an entire population. Cree Indians, North Dakota Indians that have gone north to Canada, all types of Indian tribes and bands being eradicated. So one very, very large and powerful, now powerful, lumber company could simply steal their forest, wipe out their environments, and kill the native people. At what point do we not recognize that as a genocide with the help of the Canadian government? And the very fact that Kevin Annett brought forward when he was on the show here live a month or 2 ago, the very fact that the Canadian government passed a law saying you can't sue us anymore. You can't sue the churches, you can't sue us, here's a just settlement deal. It wasn't just. I talked to the local Chumash band in Solvang area that have a very successful casino now, when they were just starting to get that casino started. And he told me, his name was Armenta, Chief Armenta. He told me they did exactly the same thing to the Chumash, and I found it hard to believe. Anyway, I want to take you now to Chatsworth, California, just outside the courthouse, where a man named Daniel Borsadi and I went in. I was going there as media to tape, also because he has Americans with Disability Act credentials. Daniel Borsadi's approved for ADA, which means he gets a free court reporter. He can make his own audio tape, and he can have me come in and videotape it. All of that denied by a newly wet behind the ears, on the bench, I think, for 2 months, judge named Tricia Taylor. This is what we did when we left the courtroom to document it. Here we go. On second thought, we're here at the Kangaroo Court of Chatsworth, Penfield Avenue, where Daniel Borsadi, well, I'll let him tell it. What happened here, Daniel?
Well, I just went into the court on the unlawful detainer case, and there was administrator, I call him. She calls herself a judge, Tricia Taylor. And I was supposed to have a court reporter there. I was supposed to be able to audio record under ADA, and they denied me all of my requests. The court came out and denied the demur after reading everything. I objected several times. She kept not trying to allow me to object, and basically what I stated was this: I swore myself in and promised under tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God is my witness only, because I wasn't sworn in previously. Then I said, without waiving any of my rights, I challenge this court's subject matter jurisdiction under Miranda versus 21st Century Insurance. Basically states, although the subject matter jurisdiction of the court was not questioned during the trial, it is well established that questions of subject matter jurisdiction are never waived and may be raised for the first time on appeal. Costa versus Bonta, 1950, 98 Cal App, 2nd. Accordingly, we consider plaintiff's argument on the merit. And then I required the court a complete statement of decisions on every objection and all rulings, which is the findings of facts and conclusions of law based on how a judge makes their judicial determination. And she stated something, she noted my objections, and I objected to that, stating what does noted mean? Because as far as I know, you're supposed to overrule or sustain. And so she said basically only after a court of 8 hours, a hearing of 8 hours or something to that effect, does she have to overrule or sustain a objection. So I objected to that as well. And furthermore, on my 446, the Judge Tricia Taylor tried to state that 446 is viable and doesn't void the complaint, that an attorney can verify. And I said, yes, however, in those cases, the pleadings shall not otherwise be considered as an affidavit or declaration establishing the facts therein alleged. And I said, what is the court relying on if the attorney verifies a complaint and doesn't transform into evidence or facts before the court? And who's going to litigate this matter? The facts or evidence rely upon, it's an inadmissible, no subject matter jurisdiction, no verified complaint before it. And then she again overruled my objection and my statements. And then I said something to her that transpired to the, let's see, 446, and then I requested with certainty that the court give a 10-day leave to amend for the plaintiff to amend their complaint. And it was denied, overruled, and so forth. Then I objected to that and said, okay, then I request with certainty that the court grant me the 10 days leave to set aside the complaint, leave to be able to, write a writ. I needed to file a writ, and that was denied, overruled, and denied as well. And that's pretty much how it gone. Then the court got up and she just shut down the case. And as soon as she did that, I said, objection. I said that the court, this administrator, I believe Trish Taylor, labeled judge, has just abandoned the court. This person has just abandoned the court. And I continued to ask questions, and the bailiff came over, with his hand on his gun, and then said, that's it, it's over, she's done. And so I asked Mike, the court clerk, what just transpired, and he said that I had 5 days to answer their complaint. And so it appeared that she already had previous information or orders to shut me down, deny my ADA request for recording, deny my ADA request for court reporter, which I'm supposed to have, and I have in all of the other cases, and they're just shutting me down left and right and not giving me an opportunity to truly be heard, because I had a lot of other issues I needed to bring up, but she denied the demur, and there was another issue in consolidation that was supposed to be heard today, and she just abandoned the court, so I wasn't able to get to that yet. So I was told I did fairly well, in that there's a lot of audience there that were listening, and a lot of people allegedly had smiles on their face because I apparently did very well. And so that's what happened today. It is the 3rd of February 2020 at Chatsworth Courthouse, courtroom F44, with the, I call administrator, Tricia Taylor presiding.
Very good. And this is William Wagner for On Second Thought and Take Back America. I was the witness. Judge was so upset, even though she asked who I was, she didn't even give me a second to give my name. And I was willing, and I tried to give her my name. It clearly appeared to me, and I've been to 1,000 of these hearings and trials, it clearly did appear to me she had prior instructions on how to rule in this case, and she was not going to let him have a court reporter. She was not going to let my camera come in. In fact, we were stopped right at the entrance gate over there. As we went in, they held my camera, then demanded to see my media pass. I went and got my media pass from the car, and still they had instructions not to allow anything in. No cameras were going to get in there. It's William Wagner for On Second Thought, Take Back America, at another American Kangaroo Court proceeding. That's all for today, folks. And she did ask him to turn off his audio recorder. I heard it. So did everybody else. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what you call a true kangaroo court, where the outcome of the trial or hearing is predetermined by the crooked kangaroo judge who's there to make certain they get the outcome they want before they hear anything. Now here's the problem. How can he appeal anything? Because she deliberately did not allow a court reporter to be supplied as required for people who are ADA rated. That stands for Americans with Disability Act. Now he may have appeared to have it all very much together, more than the average, but what you don't see is he had a full file, and he turned a page and he had prepared what he was going to read so he didn't forget and didn't get distracted. And that's probably one of the reasons he cut me off when I tried to give her my name and she asked who was sitting in the console chair right next to him. And there's something people don't know. You can choose the consular of your choice. Does not have to be a bar-carded member attorney. Anybody you choose to have sit next to you, you can choose. He chose me that day, and since I wasn't allowed to videotape it, I thought, why not? And it was interesting when the bailiff came over and said, okay, put your stuff away. Now leave. Put your stuff, get it together, and leave the courtroom. Leave the courtroom. She's done for the day. She just ran out without saying to my ears, we're done, we're finished. She didn't tell the other 35, 45 people, oh, we're taking a recess, I'll be back in 10 minutes. She just ran out. She said what she wanted to say, and she ran out. But since there was no court reporter, how can she prove she said what she said? So I made an affidavit and supplied it with them just today, the 7th. This happened on Monday. Today's Friday. And in this, among other things, I said that judge proceeded on the hearing ignoring Mr. Daniel Bersadi, and to some extent, Mr. Bersadi ignored Judge Teresa Taylor, such that there was a clear non-communication, and both ignored me, though I sat next to Mr. Bersadi. To the best I remember, that's how it went. That's just part of a 5-page affidavit I did. Point I want to make here, as long as you let bar-carded attorneys run your case, you're in danger. You're in grave danger. These people are there to make money from your suffering, whichever way makes them the most money. In the original Constitution, there's words to the effect that that we're not allowing anybody with honors from kings and princes. And then around 1810, under President Madison, they started, and it was ratified by sufficient states by 1812, the original 13th Amendment. I'm going to read you what it says. If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without the consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatever from any emperor, king, prince, or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them or either of them. In short, foreign power is the Bar Association. You can be a member of the Canadian Bar and go to New Zealand, not join the New Zealand Bar, and represent somebody. That's an international foreign power. It's a club. And no one, no matter what your attorney may tell you, has a license issued by the state of California, New York, or any other state. The Supreme Court long ago ruled that the right to practice law is a common law right, like your common law right to breathe, use the highways and byways and the roads. These are common law rights. They cannot license it. Though they try to give you a license, it's actually a commercial license. That's how they started, because commercial truck drivers were reckless back in the 20s and 30s. And now they apply that licensing to everybody. Vehicle is a word used for commercial licensing. What you people drive is your car or your private conveyance, and you're locomoting in your private conveyance. But they don't want to use that terminology. They trick you into using their commercial licensing words. In the same way, the courts are not our third branch of government, as the Founding Fathers intended it to be. These courts, all the judges were first alive today. Though this wasn't true 220 years ago, but alive today, all the judges joined a bar association at some time in their life, practiced law, and then got appointed, except for Justice White, who I think was a baseball second baseman and then got appointed to the Supreme Court because he had a law degree back, I think, in the 50s or 60s. I can't remember exactly. But you look at the first United States Supreme Court, not a single bar-carded member on it. And they made some great decisions. Dred Scott case wasn't one of them, but that was later. We need to eradicate the bar-carded judges by getting them out of office and putting them in prison for violating the original 13th Amendment, which was not only ratified, but was republished at least from 1822 to 1868. And the one I read you is from the state of Maine, published in 1825, printed by Todd and Smith, printers to the state. And I have that original volume, not a copy, not a reprint, but the original volume from 1825. I have it. So I know for what I am speaking. And it makes me laugh when I think years ago when I started doing this show, I got an email from some idiot DA here that his email address was long arm of the law. And he was threatening me, in effect. The words added up to a threat. You can't talk about the law. You can't expound on the law. Really? What a bunch of nonsense. No, these people have become arrogant, and that's why we saw Snedden pounding away on Michael Jackson, who was innocent, while they were tearing down St. Anthony's Monastery in Goleta in Santa Barbara County, where over 100 boys had been molested. And I have yet to bring you those interviews, or those, well, they're men now, who were molested at St. Anthony's. And at the same time, they were starting to prosecute Michael while they were hiding this issue of molestation at St. Anthony's. And there was a lawsuit, and they couldn't find a single lawyer in Santa Barbara that would represent the boys. So they ended up getting some attorney firm out of Los Angeles. But you don't hear anything about that. There's too many Catholics in Santa Barbara to talk about that. But Pope Benedict said some nasty things. We're going to bring you somebody else's work here in just a few minutes. I just wanted to point something out from this book, which I always urge you to watch, get and read. It's called LBJ, The Mastermind of the JFK Assassination. And these are the brooding eyes of that violent, murderous President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was part of the conspiracy to kill his own Democratic president, Jack Kennedy. But he also killed his own sister during the Christmas holidays and got her buried and put away without an autopsy, just like they took Jack Kennedy out of Texas without an autopsy, which was a violation of the Texas law. I urge you to read this book by Philip F. Nelson, published by SkyHorsePublishing.com. From that book, on page 307, just briefly, there's in mid-page, on page 307 from that book, the Kennedys discovered a pretext to remove LBJ. They already knew he was crooked and violent, and they wanted to get him off the ticket as vice president. In addition to being very frustrated by Johnson's ineptitude, John Kennedy was afraid that the Baker and Estes scandals would blow up during the 1964 campaign, jeopardizing his own re-election chances. He had discussed this with Bobby, that was his brother and the Attorney General of the United States at the time. He had discussed this with Bobby on many occasions, and despite RFK's repeated and expected denials the decision to replace Johnson had been made, it was only necessary to be able to justify it to him or anyone else. Bobby had been procuring information on Johnson's mafia ties, and specifically with his own nemesis, Carlos Marcello, a very well-noted mafia figure. A former Justice Department official had stated that on November 21st, 1963, Robert Kennedy had a thick investigative file on his desk on the Marcello LBJ connection. In the 1950s, Marcello's Texas political fixer, Jack Haflin, had arranged to siphon off a percentage of the mobsters' racing, wire, and slot machine profits for LBJ's Senate campaigns. In exchange, according to the journalist Michael Dorman in his book Payoff, LBJ had helped kill certain anti-racketeering legislation in committee because he was presiding officer of the U.S. Senate as vice president. According to the author, David E. Scheim, referencing Dorman's research, Haflin, quote, Haflin disclosed that the gambling network controlled by organized crime had given $500,000 in cash and campaign contributions to Johnson over a 10-year period. Wow. Now, the Democrats are talking about a crime for impeachment of Trump. Here's a crime, been researched and verified. Why don't they go and indict LBJ, even though he's dead? Been dead since 72, I think. He should still be put on trial, even though dead. No, they don't want to talk about the corruption of the Democratic Party. Anyway, with that said, I want to thank you for tuning in. And we're going to go to this clip done by an Italian film producer, not me, about why Pope Benedict really resigned when no pope for 600 years had ever resigned because of illness. No, they die as pope, and then they pick a new one. But this one apparently was a pedophile or a switch hitter, and he was doing something. I'll let the film tell it. Roll it.
But he was in a bind. John Paul's public celebration of Maciel made it very difficult for him to take action. And all the while, Maciel's activities went unchecked.
The situation changed at the end of 2004. At that time, Cardinal Ratzinger made a decision, to his credit, that Maciel had to be investigated. So he sent a canon lawyer in his office, Monsignor Charles Scicluna, to America and Mexico to take the testimony of these men. He clearly knew that whoever would become the next pope needed to have Maciel under investigation, lest the Vatican be tarnished by the scandal of a much-accused pedophile and nothing happening to him.
With the death of Pope John Paul, it was Ratzinger himself, now Pope Benedict, who would have to pursue the case against Maciel.
Once he's Pope, then the question becomes, how do you deal with this man? What should have happened was the order should have been disbanded, and instead he invited him to spend the rest of his life in prayer and penance.
There was no description of his crimes, no apologies to his victims.
Why didn't he just banish him? Why? Because the Legionaries of Christ is a large and very wealthy order and puts lots of money in the Vatican's coffers.
The Legion, which had defended him all along, never admitted that he abused any of these altar boys or young seminarians, announced at his death that he had gone to heaven. A year later, the legionaries announced that he had a child. Well, it soon became apparent that he had a grown daughter living with her mother, one of Maciel's paramours, in Madrid.
And it turned out a son by another woman in Mexico. The price of the church's failure to act was revealed in Jason Berry's interview with Raul Gonzalez.
He was a good person when acts like our daddy, and a demon when he acts like a predator.
Maciel lived multiple lives, and this is a rare glimpse of him on holiday. Raul and his half-brother Omar would be invited on trips like these, but Raul says there was a heavy price for the boys to pay.
All the days that we stayed with my dad, on every trip, there were abuses.
Was it mostly masturbation?
No. Well, I feel really sorry by my brother because he was penetrated by my dad, and my brother also penetrated him because my dad told him that that's what the way he was going to learn, and he always told us that how to kiss him because that's the way we were going to learn how to kiss a girl when we grew up.
And you were 10, 11 years old?
10. Whoa, I have to stop. He took me on a walk. He said,
Ratzinger gave his famous sermon shortly before the funeral of John Paul, referring to filth in the church. Many people believe, as I do, that he was really referring to Maciel, and by that time he had a good deal of information on him.
And as Pope Benedict, he also knew as much as anyone in the church the extent of the clergy sex abuse scandal. He took every opportunity to apologize.
Too, I think of the immense suffering caused by the abuse of children, especially within the church and by her ministers.
There is no doubt that for a person like Joseph Ratzinger, who is so engaged in faith, these crimes are horrible. During his trip to the United States, he told it to the reporters saying, there is no place, there has not to be place in the church for such people.
I had the opportunity to meet Cardinal Ratzinger a couple of times when he was a cardinal. I found him to be a very charming, self-effacing, gentle person. When he encountered as Pope the issue of sexual abuse of children, I think his reaction was genuine. But he was a creature of the institutional church. That's the only life he ever knew, and he could not do what was necessary.
He's a shy man, he's a very kind man, and they made him Pope. He had absolutely zero pastoral experience. Joseph Ratzinger should never